So in this session, of course, we're going back to the compassion wing of the practice. And yesterday we introduced this Glen meditation, this giving and taking meditation. A very powerful sort of meditation to really help us to reduce our selfish, self-cherishing mind, to increase the mind of cherishing others. So what I'd like to do in this session is start with another Glen practice. So again, starting with ourselves and expanding out to others. And then I'd like to particularly have a look at how we can apply this meditation sort of in daily life. And then I'd like to also talk a little bit about the more traditional way of how to do this practice with that rock of self-cherishing, and we'll do the practice again later in the session with that. So then you have sort of the both options available. But first, let's start with another Glen meditation similar to yesterday's practice. So a 20-minute session. As an act of loving kindness for yourself, allow your awareness to descend into the body, becoming aware of sensations throughout the body. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension. Relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. With each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. and allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. Again, we can begin by using this Glen meditation to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves, and then expand that out to others. We can begin by first imagining the inner purity of our mind. A level of mind untouched by any of the mental afflictions. To imagine this deepest dimension of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And then bring to mind one mental affliction that you would really like to reduce and eliminate. And imagine that mental affliction in the form of black smoke filling your body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing that mental affliction at your heart. Dissolving it into the inner purity of your mind, your inner wisdom. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. Now you're completely free of that mental affliction. And simply rest in that freedom, in that purity. Then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I had happiness and its causes. May I be truly well and happy. And then bring to mind one positive quality that you'd really like to cultivate and fully develop. And then with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from your heart, filling your body and mind, and transforming into everything you need to cultivate that quality. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending yourself whatever you need to cultivate that quality. And imagine you've now fully cultivated that quality. Simply rest in that state. And then allow your field of loving kindness and compassion to expand out to the person seated next to you. They are just like yourself, and wanting to be happy and wanting to be free of suffering. So arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all suffering and all mental afflictions. Imagining their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering and mental afflictions at your heart. And then imagine they're now completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And rejoice in this. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness in its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy, in the short term and the long term. And then imagine they've now found the genuine happiness that they seek. And take delight in this. And then allow your field of loving kindness and compassion to expand out further. And allow your mind to move around. And whoever comes to mind, attend to them. Breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart, and breathing out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. Allowing the mind to continue to move around. Breathing in with compassion, breathing out the light of loving kindness. So remember, this Tonglen, or giving and taking meditation, comes as the fifth step in this equalizing and exchanging self with others. One approach to helping us to cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta. The other one, of course, was this 7 cause and effect method, which we briefly looked at the other day. And of course, this mind of bodhicitta is the entry point into the Mahayana path to enlightenment. And bodhicitta, of course, is based on, at the foundation level, the 4 immeasurables practices, the practices of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And those 4 immeasurables, of course, we're cultivating these qualities towards all living beings. But to cultivate these 4 qualities, also we need to practice these in stages. That first, we cultivate loving kindness and compassion and so on toward ourselves, and then expand that out to people who are friends, then slowly out to people we don't know very well, and then start to expand it out to difficult people, and then eventually towards all living beings. And so that's immeasurable, the immeasurable loving kindness and measurable compassion. So we practice these in stages, but I think this Tonglen practice, even though it's part of helping to cultivate bodhicitta, I think this is a practice that we can use as a beginner, because it really directly targets the self-cherishing mind, the mind that sees my happiness is more important than the happiness of anyone else. And I think in our modern world that seems to be very strong. And unfortunately, often our modern capitalist culture tends to promote this attitude. And so I think if we can really use this practice, I think it can be very beneficial, very helpful as a method or technique to even begin to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves, and then expanding out to others. And this technique, or this practice of Tonglen, I think is very widely practiced, particularly in all the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And also, of course, this meditation we can apply in daily life. It's not simply a meditation practice. So how can we apply this in daily life? Of course, in daily life, whenever we encounter someone or see someone that obviously has some sort of suffering, physical or mental, we can do this exercise, and we can do it even in one breath. We can, on the in-breath, take their suffering, on the out-breath, give them happiness. So then we can use that seeing or encountering people with suffering as a technique for this, to cultivate loving kindness and compassion. And of course, if we're sincere and we're really trying to do this, this would of course translate into us trying to help them if we have the opportunity. Because it's easy to sort of fool ourselves and think, you know, I'm generating a lot of loving kindness and compassion towards everyone by just doing this mental exercise. And then, of course, in daily life, when we encounter suffering and we don't do anything about it, I think we're not really being sincere. It's just sort of stroking the ego, thinking we're kind and compassionate, when we're not really. So, therefore, if we do this, that, of course, will increase our loving kindness and compassion, which will translate into us being more kind and compassionate and helping of others when we have the opportunity in daily life. And also, I think, particularly when we're facing difficult situations with others, this practice can be very helpful. Because often when we're about to enter into a discussion or connection with someone else, and we're anticipating it's going to be difficult and maybe not go so well, then usually when we're entering into that situation, we're already on the defensive. We're already doing this. which means, of course, they only have to say something as slightly provocative and we react, because we're sort of like this already. So to avoid that, if as we're physically approaching this person, we can do this practice. We can take their mental afflictions and suffering, give them happiness, which means then when we enter into that difficult situation, rather than being on the defensive and being reactive, we can be more calm and more kind and compassionate. So then we'll hope more likely we will respond in a better and effective way rather than reacting with anger and irritation and so forth. So that can be very helpful. In particular, this can also be good in terms of even before we encounter them, sort of rehearsing the situation a bit in terms of how we would like it to unfold rather than how it normally happens. So that can also be very helpful. And then, of course, we can also apply this in daily life with respect to our own mental afflictions and suffering. Because generally now what often happens is when we have some mental affliction arising or some suffering arising, we often go, oh no, not that again, go away, go away, go away. And of course we just develop aversion to our own suffering. And aversion to suffering, of course, all that does is it just magnifies the amount of suffering we experience. And actually that was, I think, quite clearly highlighted in a study I saw that they did recently. And in this study they had participants in the study and they had, I think, some sort of heat pad on their leg that produced a lot of heat and was quite painful. And so they asked the participants to monitor their pain levels, and they asked them to measure it from 0 up to 100, 100 the highest. And so initially the average response was a pain level of 66. And at the same time as the heat pad, they had an intravenous drip in their arm. And initially it was only like saline solution going in, so nothing in particular. But then what they did was, and they kept asking them what their pain level was constantly, then they started introducing painkiller